Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This side of the room is getting it. This side's still getting some turkey out. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, we're going to get there, I promise. So we're going to continue on our study. We kind of left off in chapter 8 last week, around 7, and around verse 7. And even before we get started there was some where I had forgotten to mention, and even forgot to wrote down, it looked like, where we talk about this phrase that had happened over and over again, or that was quoted over and over again in the beginning of chapter 8, with the Jesus being a king or a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And that was back in Psalm chapter 110, verse 4, where he talks about that. And that's where he was quoting that over and over again. And I apologize for not getting that reference out last weekend. But we got it there. We're looking for it. We got it. We know where to find what we have there. But we move on into the last part of chapter 8, and really it's more of a kind of a segue, because we get to verse 7 of chapter 8, and he says there, "For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second." And this segue starts stepping into talking about the new covenant, because they've been talking about the better priest, and they've been talking about the shortfalls of the old law, and they'll continue to do that a little bit longer here. But now we get this, we're going to talk about why, really, that the new covenant is so much better than the old covenant. Because again, it says, if it had been faultless, if it had been perfect, if it had done everything that needed to be done, we wouldn't be looking for a second one. So he moves on there, and he says there, starting in verse 8, he says, "For he finds fault with them when he says, 'Behold, the days are coming,' declares the Lord, 'when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and will remember their sins no more.'" And so he's coming back into Jeremiah chapter 31 when he starts quoting in there, talking about the days are coming when I will establish a new covenant. And Jeremiah here's got some reference here into 2 Kings 23. This is when Josiah has got everything kind of renewed. He resets things up. They have this great Passover that they haven't had since the long days before. And things are really renewed, but in this kind of spirit of renewal, there comes along this idea that it's not just a renewal of an old thing, but that God will bring about something brand new. Something that all these things that are renewing are looking forward to. So he will make this thing. It's not necessarily that he will just take and kind of reform it and rework it into something. No, he makes something new. And so he says he's going to do this. It's not going to be the same kind of covenant that he made with their fathers. It says because it's not necessarily that the law itself wasn't what was needed, but that men, just people, the people, wouldn't continue in it. They wouldn't stay in it. They wouldn't stick to it. And honestly, he knows that it was a very difficult thing to stick to. There's mentions of that elsewhere in the New Testament, where the old law was just almost incredibly difficult to stick with. I mean, you had to remember all these things all the time. And the new covenant, he says, is going to be much better than that. It's going to be different. And it's going to be different here, he mentions here, because the idea of putting the laws in the mind and on the heart. It's not going to be on these tablets of stone that you just have to, have somebody bring to you and read for you, but that you'll embed it within yourself. It's going to be something that's going to be easier to keep with you, easier to keep, and easier to follow. And he says there, as he closes out the chapter, or what would be his paragraph, I guess, in his time, in verse 13, he says, "And speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." And here, especially speaking historically, the people he's talking to, he's telling them it's time to put this away. It's old, it doesn't work anymore, it's been replaced by something new, it's been replaced by something better, so it's ready to vanish, it's ready to put it away. Now, the idea of vanishing is not forget that it ever existed, because we know that those things happened for us as examples. That the old law would be like a school teacher bringing us up so that we can understand things in the New Testament better. But that it's not it's not part of our daily lives. I mean, does anybody really, realize that I've sinned against the Lord today, so go get my best lamb and take it to one of the elders so they can sacrifice it for us? But no, that's not how this works anymore. We put that part of the law away. Now, looking at it to learn more about the nature of God, the nature of his commandments, the nature of man when we just kind of don't understand ourselves, we can go back and look at that, but we're not following it. And this is kind of interesting because you'll see this all over the place. I can't scroll down Facebook without seeing 2 or 3 posts that quote some Old Testament thing saying, oh yeah, hypocrite. And then you get into this discussion, which sometimes turns out to be fruitless because they don't want to learn. But the idea is still there that, he says there that the new covenant makes the first obsolete. It goes right up to what Jesus said on the cross. It is finished. My work is finished. That law is finished. The old things are passed away. All these things are made new, and so it's obsolete. And so what we'll step into with chapter 9 is really talking about the old covenant and the new covenant compared a little more in the contrast of what they did and what they had versus what we now do and what we now have. And so he starts in chapter 9, verse 1. He talks about the tabernacle. He says, now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared. The first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence, is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was the golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now, he tells them we can't speak in detail of this. And the reason being is they know this. He's speaking to Hebrews. They understand what the ark was and where it sat, and where it sat inside the tabernacle, where it sat inside the temple at the time. But you remember how everything was designed. You had the court, and lots of nice walls that were built up nice and temporary until the temple was built. And you had that court, and then you had the tent. And then inside the tent was another room. And that was the Holy of Holies. And there, this earthly place, when you wanted to sacrifice something, you had to go there. That's where the priests were. That's where the altar was. That's where things went. So there was an earthly place of holiness. It was set up. It was put together. Everything was kind of there. Even when it was the temple, it was similarly designed. You had the very large court out there that the Hebrew people could go to. Then you had the temple itself they could not go into, but the priest could. And then you had the Holy of Holies that only the high priest could go into. So this design was very similar, even if it was made of different materials, but it was still, you had to go there to get things done. So you had to go there. There was an earthly place for it. And you look in there, just kind of the things that were set in there. You had the lampstand. You had the one branch up the middle, then the 6 branches, 3 off to each side. We know it these days as a menorah. Got all that going on for us. There was the table. Remember, all of this is covered in gold. This is all, the lampstand, pure gold. Anything that was structural, like a table or the ark itself, it was acacia wood overlaid with gold. And so it's all, just imagine how much gold there is involved in this. They had the table. They had the showbread on there. The 12 pieces, the 12 loaves of it. And that's a lot of this you'll find back in Exodus chapter 25, where they're discussing the design of all of this. But you had the 12 loaves there that were symbolizing God's his fellowship with the 12 tribes. You had the sanctuary, or that first part, as it's called there, the holy place, where only the priest could go. And that was where they serviced the lampstand, the incense, the showbread. But at the end of that was this veil, or a curtain. And that's what separated that place, that holy place, from the most holy place. You see that kind of at the end there, that's there. But then you see what's inside. What's inside that room, the Ark of the Covenant. It's inside the Holy of Holies. It's that chest. You've got it. It's covered in gold, about a little over 3.5 feet long, about a little over 2 feet wide, a little over 2 feet high. It's got the rings on the side because they're going to slide the poles through it to carry it because they're not allowed to touch it. What happened to the guy who's recorded as touching it? He died instantly, Uzzah, so we had a problem there, but hopefully they've learned their lesson. Matter of fact, when that happened, they just put it down kind of where it was and didn't touch it for a couple of years. It was a terrifying idea on there. But you remember the kind of things that were inside the ark. The ark was not empty. This Ark of the Covenant was not empty. There were a couple things in there. He talks about what was in there was the urn that had the manna. So they had a jar that had manna. They had Aaron's staff that had budded. Remember kind of what that event was when you had the rebellion of the people saying, we can do better than you. And God tells them, okay, throw your staffs down. And Aaron's being, both of them being pretty dead wood as a staff, actually grew buds and flowered. So we've got some miraculous things happening here that showed the acceptance that God had for Aaron's priesthood over those who would rebel against God. So we've got that staff in there. And then we have the tables of the covenant. And so if you look at kind of break that down for just a quick second and why we might bring this up and why he would describe what was in there. You think about the manna. It's to remind them of God's provision for them. That he fed them when they were coming through across the wilderness. But at the same time, when you look at it, also shows their ungratefulness. Because what was the thing they did shortly after they got manna? More manna? Can we get some meat? He provided for that as well. But it's kind of twofold there, right? Because you get that you have his provision for them, but you also get their ungratefulness. And you find Aaron's rod, and it's reminded of God's authority. This is who I set in charge of you, and I had to use this to remind you because you rebelled against me. So everything that's kind of in there has these two meanings to it, depending on which direction you're looking at it from. Even with the law, what you find is this covenant, this agreement between God and man at this time, between the Israelites and God. And here's the law. You do these things, and I will do these things for you. And that is wonderful, except that they continually didn't do those things. And so again, the three things inside the ark were reminders of how great God was, and at the same time, how shortfalling the people were. And then, of course, on top of that was the mercy seat, this kind of lid for the ark, and the designs of the cherubim that had their wings stretched out over it. And this is where, at that Day of Atonement, when the priest would go in, he would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. He couldn't open the box. He could just sprinkle it over top of it. And this was where the Shekinah glory of God, this is where he resided, right there between the cherubim inside the Holy of Holies. And that one day a year, the priest could go in and he could sprinkle blood on it. And you think about how important it was, because if you think of kind of how man looks at God, he's always above us, right? We always think of him above us. Especially in older times, there's this idea that he's not necessarily around us, but that he's above us. And so if you look at it, as a priest comes out and sprinkles blood on the top of this box, what's he doing? He's blocking that disappointment. He's covering that ingratitude. He's covering that, that rebellion, and putting blood between all of those symbols of that and God. As God resides above it, they sprinkle blood over it, and it puts it between them, and it covers it on the Day of Atonement. It's just kind of an interesting way to look at it. So as God would see the symbols of their sin, their rebellion, their failure, and the blood is a barrier between that. And because we know that they were there for the unintentional sins. And so there it was, covered by the blood of that sacrifice. And blood was always going to be very important to this. Because he says in verse 6, he continues on saying, these preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. And so he qualifies it that the priests are going into this first area all the time. They got to do their job in there. They're keeping things in order. But he says the second, only the high priest, once a year, and he never goes in without blood. And that's going to be important, because blood is incredibly important to the problem of sin. It's the answer to it. If it's the right blood, it's a temporary answer if it's not. Tom?
Do you notice that there's one thing that's out of place to the normal configuration of the temple? It's the altar of incense. That normally is in the holy place. It's only on the Day of Atonement that it's taken into the most holy place as it's described.
Yes.
So this whole scene is the Day of Atonement, not an ordinary day in the temple.
You're right. It is absolutely not. And there's actually some other, I'll step into this about how some things really got a little different around that day, not just in the rituals, and that word is incredibly important too, because it really was. You don't go into the holy place until you've washed your hands a certain way in a certain bowl. You don't walk into the Holy of Holies unless you're a certain person carrying a certain thing on a certain day for a certain purpose. And all this was done ritualistically. And so he goes in there, and again we say this idea that they regularly go in. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit, because this idea that they have to be in there constantly doing things to get the forgiveness for the people, to make atonement that's got to happen every year. All these things are happening over and over and over again. But he says there this idea that the Holy of Holies, he goes in and he takes blood. This is incredibly severe restriction on there. The one person can enter. He's got to take blood, because the blood is the thing that goes between the people's sins and God. So it covers it for that particular period of time. And he's talking specifically here about the idea of the sins committed in ignorance, or the sins committed unintentionally. Now, it was your responsibility as a Hebrew that if you sinned, you had to go to the priest and take a sacrifice. And a priest could take that, slaughter it, make the preparations, make the sacrifice on the altar, and take care of that for you. But what about the things you didn't realize you'd done? That's what the Day of Atonement was for. And that's what the priest was doing there, making sure that all the sins were taken care of. It's right up there with the same attitude Job had. When he go sacrifice for his kids on their birthdays, because just in case. And that's what this was for. It was for the things that they didn't realize they did. But interestingly enough, you see kind of the respect, in this respect, kind of the way that Jesus' work is going to be better than the work done on the Day of Atonement. Because, again, we divide those sacrifices. The ones that we know about, they would make the sacrifice for. The ones they didn't, the priest would have to do that on the Day of Atonement. The high priest only on the Day of Atonement. Jesus, he goes in, and when he does his work on the cross, it's going to work to atone for the sins we know and the ones we don't. We don't need two people to do this work. It's not done at two separate times in two certain ways. It was done once, and it was done for all. And in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 8, he talks a little bit more about the Holy Spirit giving some understanding about the Old Covenant. He says, "In this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened, as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation." He says, until the new comes along, you don't have access to it. He says that these holy places are not open to us. Unless we were a Levite, unless we were a priest, we couldn't go past the courtyard. We couldn't enter into the temple. We couldn't enter into the holy place. We couldn't enter into the most holy place because, well, that's the way the law was set up. And while that was still there, it stood in our way of getting access to God. We had to go through some other man who had to make a sacrifice for himself before he could make a sacrifice for us. And the thing that gets symbolic, this parabole, it's the same kind of word that comes out of parable. It's this idea that all of this went for deeper truths. And of course it did. We understand these shadows as we look back as how we get into this. The symbolism of the veil there that divided the holy from the most holy is being torn in half at Christ's death. All of these things symbolic of what's going on, where we were, even in the temple, most of us here, we couldn't even get into the courtyard. We had to stay out in the courtyard of the Gentiles. The Hebrews could get to the courtyard, and if you weren't wearing a robe, you didn't get into the building at all. Which is why, of course, it was so sacrilegious to them when you would have foreigners that would live inside the temple later on during the kings and during those problems. It was a big deal. But interestingly, he says there that all of these arrangements, all of these sacrifices and gifts, he says it couldn't perfect the conscience of the worshiper. At the point in time when he's writing the priestly service that's still going on, Judaism is still alive and not well when it comes to the time when he's writing this. He says, none of this is actually fixing what needs to be fixed. It doesn't actually fix the worshiper. It just kind of covers things up. And even at that time, especially because it had been done away with, it wasn't doing anything. The worshiper was not there. The cleansing was incomplete. And he says there, he talks about this idea that if they're just regulations for the body, the weakness of the service that the priest would give under the old covenant was the fact that it didn't actually provide an inner transformation. It was merely outside workings. I mean, really, when you look at the Ten Commandments, as we call them, really only one that really deals with the heart, and that's that thou shalt not covet. The rest of them are just thou shalt not take this action. And that was pretty much the whole law. Do not do this thing. Do this thing. And the new law, of course, as we understand it, says don't think about these things. Think on these things. It brings the heart, it brings the mind into it rather than just making sure the body doesn't go here. Or making sure that we do these things with the body or that we give this thing. It's all more thought and spirit, and therefore more closer to the nature of God. And so we have these regulations. He says that they were a weakness of it, because we just couldn't keep them anyway. So now he starts talking in contrast to that about the new covenant. In verse 9 he says, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, that's important too, they've actually already come, especially as he's speaking to Jews of the day, that they're still looking for something. He says that they have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, that is not made with hands, that is not of this creation. And so he talks about this idea of a greater and more perfect tent, or a greater and more perfect tabernacle. And Jesus, as our high priest, has a superior sanctuary to go into. I mean, let's look back at this. You think back at the details of how the tabernacle was put together. The great and incredible meticulousness it took to make it the first time, to know how to take it apart and how to put it back up when it needed moved. Just the furnishings and how beautiful it was. And then you even come later on when the temple is built. The preparations made by David, Solomon builds his temple, and you just look in the middle of Jerusalem up on this hill, and what do you find? This monstrous gold building. It's amazing. Just incredible to think about. I mean, how is it when the reason they think about it, when no stone will remain on another stone, or no stone shall stand on another. When Christ prophesies that, it comes true. Why? Because the Romans, they came in and they had to take all the stones apart to get all the gold out from in between the stones, because everything was overlaid with this. It was just incredible. You couldn't think that there would be something more amazing to worship God in. And here we have Christ coming and says, I have a better tabernacle. I have a better place. I have a more perfect tent, one that wasn't made with hands. Coming out of manufacturing for so long, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're never perfect. And even if your measurement says you're perfect, I can statistically prove that you can be wrong. It was my job for more than a decade, running the numbers to say this is how wrong you can be. So no matter how well they did it, no matter how great their measuring rod of their cubit was, they didn't have that building perfect. They didn't have that tabernacle perfect, but here we have Christ coming into his priesthood in a superior sanctuary, something any better than any human hands could make. Just kind of thinking how that goes along. He says there in verse 12, continues on, this is that he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls, and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of the heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. It says there the blood of bulls, or the blood of goats, calves was insufficient. You know what? It doesn't do the job. It temporarily did everything. But he says there in the very beginning of verse 9, he said, or verse 12, that he entered once. He sacrificed once, and that was sufficient. But the blood of bulls and goats, the blood of goats and calves, the heifers could not fix what needed to be fixed. I'm going to throw this out there for a quick second. So you think about when they first set up the tabernacle, and you think about, that many people that wanted to be right in God's sight. So when they realize they sin, they're taking an animal and it gets slaughtered, and it is sacrificed. It's a lot of blood in a cow. You think about how much blood there was to a single sacrifice. Now you think about that these priests were busy all day long with this, as people would just come up with this. And that would wane over time, because people would fall away. They would become less concerned about it, but then it would pick back up. So just imagine here, every day, except for the Sabbath, of course, as they're all at home not working. So you've got all these days where people are just bringing these animals and constantly, just think about how much blood that took, how much blood there was. I mean, when you think about the tabernacle, and you think about this wonderful tent where God resides, do you realize that the ground beneath it is just saturated with blood? Could you imagine the smell? Imagine, just think about that. Now, let's go farther on. When we go up sometime, and they finally build this glorious, beautiful gold building, you know what the first thing they did was when they dedicated it? They covered the thing in blood. Look back at there when you find, go back into the Old Testament, look at when they dedicated that temple. How many animals were killed? How much blood had to be running off of that hill? It's an amazing amount of blood there, and what he says here is that they couldn't do the job. It doesn't matter how many, bazillion gallons of calf's blood drenches this altar. It doesn't fix it. It's just a temporary thing. And here we have in verse 12 that Christ enters in once. Christ enters in with what he contains within his own body, and that, because he is perfect, without blemish, offered by himself, a perfect person, without blemish and without sin, that was what did the job. That was what was demanded. That was that payment that needed to be made. The rest of it was just rent. Now it's been bought. Now it's been redeemed. Because the animals, they just didn't have it. He says there, if they could, how much more does the blood of Christ? If they could sanctify and purify the flesh, the blood of Christ can do so much more. It goes to what the problem with the old law was. It works on the conscience. It gets into the heart. It gets into the mind, not just the thou shalt not eat this bread on this day. It's more about how we love each other, how we treat each other, how we look at the world, and how we work in the world. And so this shadow of all these sacrifices, the shadow of this temple, all done away with once the perfect sacrifice is done, and once he enters into the perfect tabernacle, or the perfect tent as it's called there. Because whereas that priest would have to go that one day a year, that high priest would walk into the Holy of Holies and offer that sacrifice every year, he's not allowed to stay there. There are actually some thoughts and some records that they prepared, that what he would do is when he would get into the presence of God there, that he would just spend as little time as possible. Because it really wasn't a relationship with God. It was simply a service for the people. But historically, they've had some records that the other priest would just have this party when he comes back out, because my goodness, you walked in to God and you came back out. And they would celebrate this, that he survived his meeting with God, because so many people don't. Especially with the job that he had going in there to atone for the sins of the people with the blood. And so now we have Jesus. He's gone in there and he doesn't leave. He stays all the time. He is there at the right hand of God, constantly interceding for us, not having to leave, do other things, and then come back in a year and do it again. It was done once. He stayed there, and there's no reason for him to leave aside from coming back, and we'll talk about that a little later in the chapter. And so he stays the mediator of that covenant because he is the one who set it all together. And he set it all together, we legally speak of this in verse 16. He says, for where a will is involved, or a testament, if you're depending on your translation, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of the calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. In the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. I kind of mentioned that earlier. Just every time that something happens, there's blood involved. So much blood. Puts, modern slasher films to shame for everything that was involved. And here we have the fact that this New Testament he talks about, this will, someone had to die for it to take place. We always had that joke with my grandmother, not me so much, but my mom and my aunt, and they're just kind of joking. She says, want that mirror after you're gone, but you can't have it now because I'm still here. All this stuff is still mine right now. This whole will and this whole testament happens after they're gone, after somebody's gone. You can't just start divvying up somebody's possessions before they're gone. It hasn't taken effect. And here we understand that, and now we understand that the old law put away, new law put in place because of his death. And now the rest of it it's a fitting kind of word, will, that, we have what he wants us to what his will is for us to do, just as I'm sure we all do, somewhere written down, have the desires for what we would like to have happen with all our stuff. Then the same thing's happened here. Now that he has died, he has given himself, that's in effect. His blood has signed that for us. Well,
that verse 16 pretty much answers the question about the thief on the cross. People say, well, he wasn't baptized. I have a will that I'm going to leave everything to my children. But while I'm still alive, I can give anything of that away that I want to.
Yes.
Before my death. And Christ gave salvation to the thief on the cross because he hadn't died yet.
And that's an excellent point when that kind of gets brought up every once in a while. We kind of stumble a little bit. Here's the good answer. It was his to give. He didn't live, that thief did not live under the same law we lived under, or that we live under now. It's been put away, and now we have something even better. It's been inaugurated or put in place by his blood. And it's so often that too many people think that sin is forgiven over time, that sin is forgiven by their works. They kind of wash things away themselves by overbalancing the scale. No, it doesn't happen that way. No, shedding of blood. And in our case, as humans, as we have existed, our case here is that it needed a perfect sacrifice. Because quite honestly, I don't want my sins covered. I want them removed. And the old law couldn't remove them. It wasn't designed to remove them. It was designed to cover them. It wasn't designed to wash them away. It was simply designed to, turn the cushion over so you can't see the stain on the couch, right? In this case, what we're dealing with now is the removal of the stain. And we have that through Jesus. We have that through his sacrifice. And so that perfect sacrifice is what happens inside that perfect sanctuary that he's in now. And that's chapter in verse 23 continues on, saying, thus it was necessary for the copies of heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the whole holy place every year with blood not his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of all the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man once to die, and after that comes the judgment. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will he appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. And we touched on this just a moment ago, this idea that he walked in one time. That's all it took. One time, and he was able to take care of it, rather than those high priests who would have to go in every year. And you think about this idea, this is if these were these copies of heavenly things, the things that we have are so much better than the things that they had, the copies, the shadows. But now we find Christ in heaven himself, in the presence of God, and he stays in the presence of God because he's not afraid to be in the presence of God. When you find any sane person who is ever in the presence of God, they tremble. They're afraid. The people, when Moses was in the presence of God up on the mountain, and the people, what happened? He was gone too long. He's dead. He's not coming back. They were afraid constantly. Jesus is not afraid to be there. Why? Because he doesn't think it's robbery to be equal to him, because he's part of him. And that makes him better than the high priest we've had before and under the old law. And again, he says there was this idea that the priest would go into the holy place, the most holy place, with blood that wasn't even his own. He had to get it from somewhere else. Why is the sacrifice for us much better? Because it was his own blood. He paid that cost, not the best, bull in the nation. He himself was the best sacrifice in the nation, the best lamb without the blemish. And it's amazing here that how much better this is for us, that he would offer himself the one time rather than offering someone else's. Someone else would pay the price. He just handed the cash over. On Jesus' behalf, he was the price. He was the one who paid it. And it's interesting that he talks here at the end of that it is appointed once for man to die, and after that comes judgment. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, here we are to die once. It's been appointed that we will separate from this body. Either we'll be called out of it, or we will simply, come out of it at death. But the idea here is that we have that once. And Christ, again, we're back to these ones, just the one sacrifice. And what I love about it in the end is that he says he's coming back. He says there at the end of verse 28, into the chapter, that Christ, he's been offered once to bear the sins of many, and he will appear a second time. But I love what he says there, but not to deal with sin. And that's an important note here. He's coming back to where the sacrifice was offered, but it's not to offer another sacrifice. He's not dealing with sin. Anybody know why he's not going to deal with sin when he comes back? Because he's already dealt with it. It's already taken care of. He's not coming back to double check his work. He's not coming back to get the few things he missed. He's not coming back to make sure that everything is just right. Because it already is. He's already made the sacrifice. He's already done the work. He's not going to deal with sin. So if he's not coming back to deal with sin, what's he coming back for? Raise your hands, guys. He's coming back for us. That's what the purpose of this is for. And this is even going to speak to here, even before it's written, some of the arguments that people are going to make out of Revelation when it comes to this idea of him coming back to reign here. He simply says he's coming back for us. Not to deal with sin, not to perfect the earth, but to get those that have already accepted the perfection, so to speak, that he's offered already. And so here he has those who are eagerly awaiting for him. He's to come get us, to save us from all of this. And that's just an amazing comfort, because the thing is, again, as we mentioned, that the high priest would go in and his buddies outside would set a party up for him so that if he came out alive, they could celebrate that he had entered into the presence of God and that he had come out and he was fine when he got back. That's amazing. And here we have our Savior coming back, and we celebrate he's taking us with him to the presence of God. Rather than being celebratory that somebody survived the presence of God, celebrating that we get to go survive in the presence of God. And that's an amazing thing to look at. That second time that he comes back, he already dealt with sin. Now he'll come back and take us to the place where he told his apostles that he went to prepare for us. And that's a comforting thing, because all the things that the priest could do didn't really prepare anything for the people. It simply dealt with the things that had already been done. Jesus is up there doing things for our future, doing things for our present, because he's already taken care of the past. And he simply asks us that we eagerly await for him. And that's just a matter of following his word and being obedient to him. I I think I'm back on track now that we got 9 taken care of. So hopefully we'll be getting things wrapped up here in the next couple of chapters, getting through Hebrews. I appreciate all your attention. Let's close with a quick word of prayer. Father, God, Heavenly King, thank you so much for what you've done for us. Thank you so much that we have the ability to look into your word this morning, to study and look at the perfect sacrifice of your Son and the more perfect way that you have of dealing with our sins and our ability to approach you through your Son, and our hope that we have, that we'll be able to approach you directly through just being in your presence throughout all eternity. We're thankful for the hope that we have and the ability we have to look forward to it. Be with us now, dear Lord, as we go down through our worship. Pray that you would be with us, that all things that we do would be in accordance with your word. Our worship would be acceptable and pleasing to you. And we ask it all in Jesus' blessed and holy name. Amen.